The following audio recording was recorded in November 12, 2021 at the University of Nebraska College of Law. It was recorded as part of our Lane lecture with Judge Jeffrey Sutton from the United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The information has been recorded and presented here for your consumption. Preceding the discussion by Judge Sutton, I provided an introduction which I'll recreate. I'm pleased to welcome Chief Judge Jeffrey Sutton to the College of Law. Judge Sutton is a history teacher, turned lawyer, turned judge, turned academic. Well, maybe not quite turned academic, but academic nonetheless, in a very good sense of the word. After law school at The Ohio State University, he clerked for Judge Meskel on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and for Justice Powell and Justice Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Sutton served in private practice and as a Solicitor General of Ohio, which is where his interest in state constitutional law probably began. He was appointed to the Sixth Circuit in 2001 and recently became the Chief Judge. He's taught courses in state constitutional law at Ohio State as well as Harvard and NYU, among others. The judge is here to talk about his new book, Who Decides? States as Laboratories of Constitutional Experimentation. This is Judge Sutton's second book on state constitutions, with his first one in 2018 entitled 51 Imperfect Solutions, States in the Making of American Constitutional Law. Jonathan Marshfield and I asked Judge Sutton to join us for this Lane lecture as well as tomorrow's Direct Democracy Symposium based on this work. And Nebraska is clearly one of those state laboratories. While many of our constitutional provisions are unique to Nebraska's collective wisdom, famously our unicameral legislature, many of Nebraska's provisions are not unique, though perhaps still wise. Limitations on the legislative process, including prohibitions on special legislation, for example, have a long lineage across state laboratories. Judge Sutton's work invites us to consider the unique and common as we gain a more robust understanding of the theory, doctrine, and application of government law, from rights in his first book to structure in this one. It's my pleasure to welcome him to Nebraska to deliver this Lane lecture on his work and to help tomorrow as we try to gain a better understanding of state constitutional law with particular application to direct democracy. Judge Sutton, welcome.
Books about state constitutions. It's not everyone's taste, and I can kind of prove the point. I remember when I did my first book, I was at church on a Sunday, and this wonderful friend, Dr. Dick Briggs, not a lawyer, comes up to me and said, "Jeff, I heard you wrote a book that's so exciting. Is it an autobiography?" And I said, "Well, no, Dick, it's not an autobiography." And he goes, "Well, it's a mystery. I really love mysteries." And I said, "No, it's not a mystery." And he goes, "Well," frustrated, "what's it about?" And I said, "Well, it's about state constitutions," with way too much enthusiasm. Dick Briggs is super polite, had no idea what to say next, and finally said, "You sure it's not a mystery?" And I think that's not a bad way to think about it. Why would a federal judge write about state constitutions? I don't get this issue in my job. There's no efficiencies of learning about state constitutions, much less writing about them. It turns out my interest in state constitutions is partly, Professor Schutz said, it comes from my being State Solicitor General of Ohio back in the mid-90s. That's when I learned about state constitutions. But my real passion for it, and the real reason I'm spending so much time on it, is the reality that I'm a federal judge. I practice a lot in the federal courts in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'm very nervous about the path the federal courts are heading. So my interest in state constitutions, of all things, grows out of nervousness about the reality that I worry we're asking too much of the federal courts in general to solve society's problems, and too much of the U.S. Supreme Court in particular. So chapter one of this newest book is called Umpiring and Gerrymandering. And those two key words give you a sense of where I'm going, at least with one feature of this book. So the umpiring part, to most of you, is a familiar word when it comes to judging, given Chief Justice Roberts' testimony during his confirmation hearing, where he analogized being a judge to being an umpire at a baseball game. We just call balls and strikes. There's a strike zone. No one ever went to a baseball game to see the referee. As someone who went through the confirmation process, had a very difficult time in the confirmation process, I thought it was a great analogy to try to explain to some people, many of them not lawyers, what judges do. Now, some people criticize the metaphor on the ground that, well, judges have a little more discretion over the strike zone than an umpire in a baseball game. I don't think you're giving enough credit to how hard it is to referee a baseball game, if you ask me. It's a fluctuating strike zone, and they now televise every single pitch. I mean, this is not a job for a thin-skinned person. But be that as it may, whether the analogy is good or bad, the analogy actually illustrates a slightly different problem. And this is the point initially I want to make, at least one problem when it comes to what we're asking at the US Supreme Court these days. You know, the reason the analogy works so well is we like to think of judges, we should think of judges as not players in the game, right? That's the point of the referee. You get a neutral person, not affiliated with either team, to call outs, balls and strikes and so forth. The problem with judging today is judicial review creates this real paradox for judges and separation of powers. So we started judicial review with the idea that we had three different branches of government at the federal level, same at the states. And you think of judicial review as this branch of government, the courts, that was checking the political branches by construing the Constitution, whether it's a structural guarantee, a rights guarantee, and potentially limiting that other branch of power. The problem with this separation of powers approach, the problem with the umpiring analogy, is when the US Supreme Court identifies an area in which the federal Constitution applies. Let's say they say there's a dispute between the president and Congress, and they say the Constitution speaks to a fight they're having, or it speaks to a fight the state legislature's having with an individual. You no longer have just two players in the game, right? Because the US Supreme Court is saying the US Constitution speaks to the issue. They have to issue a decision that explains how that guarantee works in that particular situation. And then that precedent, now on the books, is invoked by future parties. And the next time the case comes up, it's not two players, it's three players. And it's not because they're biased, it's because they're the ones that wrote that decision. They're the ones that interpreted that guarantee, and they're the decision makers for the next fight between president, Congress, state, and individual, you name it. And what's happened, in my view, over American history, whether you measure it from 1776 or 1789, is the original goal, separation of powers, which is designed to keep balance of power, we've lost track of that goal. And what I would say we have is an imbalance of power. And the imbalance is the US Supreme Court just having too great a say and too many issues of the day, whether structural or individual. Another way of putting it, their footprint in American government continues to grow. So that's what the umpiring part of the Chapter 1 reveals to me. Here's the second part that I find quite surprising. It's that our appetite for the federal court's authority over American government continues to grow. At the same time, we as Americans have become deeply skeptical of extreme partisan gerrymandering. I, for one, think we Americans are right to be very skeptical of gerrymandering. It's been really hurtful to our civic discourse. It has a lot to do with why politics in America are so polarized. It has a lot to do why Congress and many state legislatures are unable to address issues they should be addressing. If you have a world in which most 90% of the state or federal districts are safe, in other words, a Republican's always going to win or a Democrat's always going to win, that means the real elections are the primaries. And if the real elections are the primaries in 90% of our legislative races, that means the way you win a primary is you go to the extremes. So if you're Republican, you find the Republican agenda and you push it as hard as you can, in the same way the other direction. There's no way the average politician is not going to respond to that incentive. And I think we've watched that over the last 10, 20 years. And that's why we now have cases There's a chapter in the book you'll see on the gerrymandering cases at the US Supreme Court, followed by gerrymandering cases in state courts under state constitutions. But for present purposes, don't think about those cases. For present purposes, I want to say what strikes me as quite the conundrum. How is it that we all know gerrymandering, when it comes to designing legislative districts, is a problem, and yet can think it's a good idea to have 5 out of 9 life tenure justices making so many of the key decisions in American society? That just doesn't make sense. The thing you don't like about, one does not like about gerrymandering is a group, a political party, an interest group, whatever it is exercising power they have not earned and do not deserve, right? That's what it means. You skewed the districts to allow a party to get power to do something they did not have authority to do and did not earn. How is it that we think 5 out of 9 life tenure justices should be able to do something which is frankly way more powerful? In its extreme forms, judicial review is the greatest form of gerrymandering ever known. Now, do I mean all judicial review is like gerrymandering? No, I don't want to overstate my case. But the things we fight the most intensely about are the ones where I think we have to put that into the conversation. Substantive due process, unenumerated rights. All right, those are the things we really fight intensely about. And if those rulings at the US Supreme Court come out our way, they constitutionalize a right we feel deeply about, we're pretty happy about it. That's quite the victory, right? You've got the right recognized you think should be recognized, and you've sidelined your opponents who take the competing view. But that kind of, particularly when it comes to 51, 49 cases where it's, the American populace is very divided, those can lead to a lot of resentment. And those kind of cases where the court can't point to anything other than other cases, they can't point to anything. That's what an unenumerated right is, right? It's not in the Constitution. Substantive due process, I think we would all agree, leaves a lot of room for judicial discretion when it comes to identifying new judicially enforceable rights. And then even some guarantees that are in the Constitution, but are written at a very high level of generality, at the periphery, you get into a somewhat similar situation, whether it's free speech, what processes do, free exercise of religion, cruel and unusual punishment, unreasonable search and seizures. The further out you get, the more one should be worried that the court is exercising, quite a bit of power, sometimes in situations where there really isn't a consensus behind what they're doing. Now, in one sense, we're still at the mystery part of the talk, by the way, because this is all federal. So this part, you can understand why I like this, but what does that have to do with state constitutions? In one sense, I should love this trend in US Supreme Court history, which is really about last 60, 75 years. I'm a federal judge after all. If you manage money, you'd rather manage more. If you have a job in government, you'd rather have a job with more power rather than less. So in one sense, my ship has come in as a federal judge participating in these great decisions where we identify new judicially enforceable rights. But the American people, fools though they may be in the short term, are not fools in the long term. And the one thing that has happened over the last decade or so is they're on to the idea that the US Supreme Court is exercising authority in areas they care deeply about. And of course, to the average American, it has nothing to do with separation of powers, state or federal constitution. It has to just do with one thing. Do I care really deeply about this issue or that issue? And is the court doing what I think is right? And that's why we would have a presidential election in 2016, turned by too many accounts to deny, on a sufficient number of Americans using a vote for president of the United States as a proxy to fill one seat on a 9-member court. That is such an astonishing development in American history that would happen. And, we judges who work so hard to try to show our what we're doing is neutral and principled when it comes to decision making, we have to face this reality that because the American people have become so focused on who their judges are, particularly who their US Supreme Court justices are, that votes in the Senate confirmation process now tend to be essentially 100% partisan. And the last couple Supreme Court justices, it's only 1 or 2 switch votes. I mean, we're not far away from a perfectly partisan set of votes. And it's even spread to the lower courts. That actually been going on for a while. How can the American people, they can listen to judges and justices say what they're doing is not political, but then have their elected officials acting very politically and simply saying, if it's a Republican nominee and I'm Republican, I always vote for. And if it's a Democrat, I always vote against. How can they not watch that and think this is starting to look like a political branch from their perspective? And once they perceive the courts as a political branch, of course, the day of reckoning has arrived, because why does one political branch, the federal courts, have authority to check other political branches, the president, the Congress, a state legislature, governor, or for that matter, a state court? Well, this, of course, is where state constitutions and state courts come in. In my view, we have just lost sight of our origins when it comes to the role of judges in America. There's never been a country in world history that embraces judicially enforceable rights more than we do. If I had my druthers, all judges, state and federal, would do less and allow the policymaking elected branches of government to do more. But I may be delusional in thinking we can revive state constitutional law, but I don't think I'm a complete fool, and it's not worth swimming against that stream. You'll drown. You want to swim with this stream, and to me, the way to swim with this stream is not to say we should get rid of judicially enforceable rights in American constitutional law and American government. It's to say, why are we not doing this in a slightly different way? If we're going to have unenumerated constitutional rights, substantive due process rights, outer edge free speech rights about campaign finance, gun protection rights that are perhaps beyond the Second Amendment, whatever it is, right and left, there's nothing political about what I'm saying. It cuts in both directions across political parties. If we're going to insist on doing that, why are we accommodating winner take all, one size fits all, one-stop shopping at the U.S. Supreme Court every time a new rights dispute develops? And to me, this is where the state courts and state constitutions have a really big role to play. And I can start, it's so hard to find anything in American government that Americans still agree about. It seems like nothing is untouchable. All of our first principles are up for grab. But one that I think we still embrace, at least in the abstract, is this virtue of federalism identified by Justice Brandeis, that, if you have a difficult social problem, whatever it is, as a matter of today, it could be opioids, it could be data privacy, it could be parts of the pandemic, but you have something that people just can't put their finger on how to solve. I think we all get the intuition that it's better to let states be laboratories of experimentation rather than nationalizing a solution right at the outset when there's a lot of risk with that solution, right? It could end very badly for all 51 jurisdictions, all 330 million Americans. Far better to let a brave state try this approach. If it works, it can spread, it can export the idea to another state. And if a winning insight emerges, why then you nationalize this insight, this solution. Now, what Brandeis was referring to is these laboratories of experimentation were state legislatures, not state courts. And you can basically boil down everything I'm saying in this book and the one before to this insight. Why are we not taking that approach and doing the same thing with state courts and state constitutions? When we talk about identifying new rights that aren't in the Constitution, whether through unenumerated rights philosophy, substantive due process, or when we're identifying new prohibitions affected by the unreasonable search and seizure clause, free exercise, free speech, these really general words, why are we not using the state courts in this, as kind of the first responders, the experimenters in chief, where the trial and error should happen before we nationalize the right? There's so many values to this. One, you improve the odds when the court tries to nationalize, they nationalize it in the right way. Like why wouldn't you want that? You lower the temperature, because if you develop a consensus, these winning insights emerge in the state courts construing this guarantee or that guarantee. The stakes of the US Supreme Court nationalizing decision, the one-size-fits-all decision, it's not that big a deal if lots of states have already done that. It makes the US Supreme Court nationalizing decision far less controversial, leads to far less resentment, far less backlash. So to me, that's like the biggest head scratcher about American government today. Now, one part of this should not be a head scratcher, and I guess it's quite obvious. There are no interest groups for state constitutions. There are no interest groups for federalism. Every interest group that ever existed in this country was always about, if you can get a victory in DC, you want the victory in DC. Why wouldn't you? I mean, it's almost like a fiduciary duty of an interest group. So the interest groups always want to go to DC, whether it's Congress or the US Supreme Court. And I think that's the reason it's kind of uphill when it comes to doing this. But we are at a moment in American history where it is a little more realistic to have state citizens thinking about their state courts and state constitutions as a good place to go for property rights, equality rights, liberty rights, criminal procedure rights, because this is not the Warren Court. The US Supreme Court today, whatever you want to call it, however you want to characterize it, whether you like it or don't care for it, it's just not a court that's innovating as many rights. So it might be that we're at a time in American history where more people are going to see the utility of going to state courts and state constitutions when it comes to rights disputes. And it's worth remembering when you think about those disputes, it's a really big frustration of mine about the lack of education about state constitutions. I mean, just to give you a sense of how bad, what a gap there is here. The last time they did a poll on this, it was basically, I think fewer than 50% of Americans realized their state had a constitution. Now, the first time I heard about that poll, I was already a lawyer, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then I remembered, oh, Jeff, when you took the bar, you passed the bar, then you went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and you then had this ceremony where you took an oath to uphold the U.S. and the Ohio Constitution. Well, that was a little bit of a fraud. I didn't know what the Ohio Constitution said. I did know it existed, but I didn't know much about it. And I think I'm typical of most law graduates, because most law schools do not offer courses on state constitutions. The thing you learn, and I'm not going to impose this on anybody else. I really am not in a position to give you an assignment, but and it seems really tacky on a Friday afternoon. These are like the people that are least deserving of an assignment. So we'll call it an unenforceable assignment, except to the extent you have a fervid conscience. Just open the Nebraska Constitution tonight and just read Article 1 and Article 2. It won't even take you 5 minutes. You will be so stunned at how different the language is in the Nebraska Constitution when it comes to most of the individual rights we're so familiar with. There are a couple guarantees, like your Fourth Amendment guarantees, basically word for word, but the free exercise one has got so much more detail. The right to conscience, your arms bearing one is so different. So one of the things most people don't even realize is these state constitutions have a lot more language. They have rights that aren't even in the federal constitution sometimes. They have separation of powers guarantees that are much more strict than you see at the federal level. That's your Article 2. You have a standalone separation of powers article. I would take a lot of pride in that. I think that's really neat. So one thing that's just so funny is we only think of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's this danger of a single story. We think of the U.S. Supreme Court only as the guardian of our rights, the U.S. Constitution only as the source of that authority. And yet every one of these rights we care so deeply about and fight so intensely about originated in a state constitution, usually lots of state constitutions. The greatest era of constitution writing in this country, I would say, in world history, is before the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. It starts in 1775 when you have couple precocious colonies. And it goes really for roughly the next 10 years when these state constitutions are all innovated. And that's where the provisions of the Bill of Rights come from. That's where the structure of the federal Constitution comes from. So why are we not taking a little more pride in these guarantees? And what that means, and this is the really important point when it comes to protecting liberty, property, equality rights. If there's a local or state law that one does not care for, there's a local or state criminal prosecution that you think is wrong or your client thinks is wrong, you have two shots, not just one, to get relief for your client. Every one of those cases implicates the federal guarantees. You know, I'll give you an example that just shows you how just almost amusing it is that we prioritize federal con law over state con law the way we do. So the last year for which we have numbers, the criminal cases in this country, there were 17 million in the state court systems. That's the 50 states combined, 17 million cases. Federal system, that's the 50 states, the 94 districts, same territory, combined, 70,000. 17 million in the state courts, 70,000 in the federal courts. Those 17 million state cases, every single one of them had probably multiple opportunities for state and federal criminal procedure relief. And yet all we want to talk about is the federal Constitution. I mean, for the students in the room, if you have a practice, and God willing you will, you're gonna be in state court. That is where the action is. And the ratio is pretty much the same if you expand it out to civil and criminal cases. So the last point I would make, and then I'd love to take questions on things I've said or anything else relating to Fed con law, state con law. One of the things I think we've lost track of, and this is a virtue of federalism that I'm not sure we do all embrace today. I think once one feels strongly about a right or a structural point, one's very inclined to think it ought to be protected in every corner of the country. So I guess I call it the uniformity position about constitutional rights. The first point is to remember you don't believe that. The reason I know you don't believe that is I don't think there's anybody in this room that thinks Buck versus Bell, the eugenics decision from 1927, written by Justice Holmes, has the infamous line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. I doubt there's a single person here that thinks all the state courts should have followed that decision, okay? So that proves you don't prioritize uniformity. That proves you think there are ample times, good occasions to have disuniformity in constitutional law protections, namely when the US Supreme Court under-enforces a right. So be careful with assuming uniformity is always the right idea. I think it's usually just a proxy for how deeply you care about the right. It's been my experience. But there's another virtue of federalism that I think we've lost track of, and that's that not everything has to be nationalized. I mean, one of the things I've so enjoyed about going to speak to different law schools and different state courts around the country is just coming to appreciate what a diverse country it is. I mean, even if you just focus on the land, like just forget everything else, just what you can see, not even talking to people. It's just, if you just focused on what you could see in this country, you would just find yourself saying, it does stand to reason they'd have different norms in these places. Some places are going to feel a little differently about guns in a rural area than, say, New York City. Property rights are going to mean different things where you've got an urban center, development's very difficult, whereas where you've got land is not your problem. Culturally, you've got, parts of the country where people of faith, that's a very big thing. It's a very big feature of that area. How is that not going to translate into some norms that are reflected in law? So the thing I would say is one of the things I love about state courts and state constitutions, they allow us to express that. And sometimes it just turns out that, Nebraskans do something a little different from Ohioans, and there's nothing wrong with that. As long as there's not a federal backstop that's being ignored, ideally a federal backstop that's actually in the Constitution. I do get nervous about innovating rights that aren't there, but it seems to me fine. And the last point I'd like to make, which is I guess my compromise, I said I'm not even going to swim against the tide, the river, the current of identifying new judicially enforceable rights. I've written decisions that show I have very little respect for substantive due process and unenumerated rights. I just don't care for it, and you're free to press me on that in the Q&A. But even that I'm willing to compromise on. If we're going to have substantive due process rights and we're going to have unenumerated rights, let's at least make sure that there's objective evidence of this new norm in society that needs to be nationalized through a substantive due process decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the best way to get that evidence is through state court decisions, state constitutional amendments, and state legislative action. And when federal judges are identifying new rights that aren't in the Constitution, let's remember what's going on. That usually means you're adding something to the Constitution that's not there, or sometimes subtracting something that is there. And what does that ultimately mean? That means you're ignoring Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the amendment process. Article 5 requires 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment. So it probably should be the case, if you want to have a legitimate U.S. Supreme Court substantive due process decision, it probably ought to be the case that you've got pretty good evidence that 3/4 of the states support what you're doing, even if they're not formally going through the amendment process. That insight, by the way, is equally useful in dealing with one of our biggest problems, which is not creating new rights. It's figuring out whether to preserve the rights we've already identified in the Constitution and are under attack. In fact, if you think about Supreme Court nomination fights, as often as not, they're about protecting decisions on the books as they are identifying new rights that the court could discern or identify. Why shouldn't that be a useful criterion in thinking through whether something ought to be overruled? In other words, you have a decision from 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. It's become a norm in American government. It's a norm. It may have been wrong, but that's the point of stare decisis. You preserve some wrongly decided decisions. And maybe the ones that have gained acceptance over quite a few decades deserve to stay. And maybe the ones that haven't are the ones that are worth thinking about. But again, the point is just remember what it means to add something to the Constitution or take it away. It means you're circumventing the Article 5 amendment process, which is very stiff and, arguably a defect in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, if I had one thing I'd like to replace, it would be to make it a little easier to change the Constitution through amendment rather than interpretation. But this ought to be an audience that agrees there are at least some circumstances where variation is fine. I mean, you've insisted on your unicameral legislature. I love you for it. It shows you how thrifty you are, how much money you've saved. Has anyone ever done the calculation how much money you've saved ever since, George Norris innovated the unicameral legislature through the initiative, which was really fun because that's the topic for tomorrow. Other states, by the way, did try it. Oregon tried it before you guys used its initiative, and it didn't work. And I've heard people in Ohio talk about it, but I don't know. It's hard to throw people out of power in an election. I would say it's even harder to take their job away, which is, I think, what it means to go from bicameral to unicameral, to say we're not only not going to vote for you next time, we're removing your seat. So good for you in doing it. Makes a lot of sense to me. So I'd love questions on anything and everything. I don't think we're going to talk football today, but everything else is good.